Today is October 20, 2018, and we are at Clark Retirement Home, 1551 Franklin Street, Southeast, Grand Rapids, Michigan, 49506. We're going to be interviewing James F. Campbell, whose date of birth is August 22, 1926. Jim is a resident of the Clark Retirement Home. His apartment number is 2085 at the same address. And I, as interviewer, am Wallace J. Erickson, a volunteer interviewer with the History Department at Grand Valley State University, Allendale, Michigan. In addition to being the interviewer, I'm also the camera operator and audio operator. Jim, can you give us your full name?
Yes, James F. Francis Campbell, F-R-A-N-C-I-S, Campbell, C-A-M-P-B-E-L-L.
And what is your date and place of birth?
My date of birth is August 22, 1926, at Boston, Massachusetts.
And what branch of service did you serve in?
U.S. Navy.
And where did you serve then, Jim?
My boot camp that I participated in was at Sampson, S-A-M-P-S-O-N, New York.
Jim, what war did you serve in?
World War II.
And what was your highest rank in the Navy?
Signalman, 3rd class.
Now, Jim, you were born in Boston. What did your parents do? What did your dad do for a living, for instance?
My dad was an immigrant from Ireland, as was my mother, from the same county, but they never, County Donegal, D-O-N-E-G-A-L. They came to the United States. My mother came in 1912, my father, after that, I think it was about 1915. And he worked in Newton Center, C-E-N-T-E-R, C-T. Anyway, as a coal man, delivering coal, down, carrying coal on his shoulder in a heavy canvas bag and dumping it down a chute into the basement of every house.
Had your parents known each other before they emigrated to the U.S.?
No, they had not, even though they were from the same county in Ireland.
So they were married in Boston area then?
They were married in Newton Center at Sacred Heart Church in 1925.
What did your mother do?
My mother, when she arrived in 1912, she arrived on the U.S.S California, which was made in Scotland. And that ship on its way back to Ireland and England was one of the first ships to pick up people from the Titanic. My mother then worked in Boston after being held at Ellis Island for her poor eyesight until a cousin came and spoke in her behalf. And that was about, well, from then on she worked as a, as they say, a live-in housemaid for $3 a month. brought her another sister over, and they kept contributing to the fare of another sister and a brother until I think there was 4 of them total that came over in the early part of World War I. My mother worked there and at another house, apparently, as best I know, as a live-in housemaid.
How many siblings did you have then, Jim?
There was 6 of us, including myself. I am the oldest of 6. All were born in Boston, in the same location.
Where were you in the birth order then?
I was the first one.
The oldest then?
I'm the oldest.
Where did you go to elementary school?
It was a public school in Newton Highlands, Massachusetts. It was called the Hyde School, Hyde, part of the Newton, Massachusetts system.
In high school?
I went to Newton High School as well.
Okay.
Which at that time, when I attended it and graduated in 1944, the school was highly rated academically throughout the country. The high school, that is. And maybe the system, for all I know. But they had a good reputation, and the academics were tough in high school.
What did you do after high school?
Immediately after the high school, I filed for working in the Navy, U.S. Navy. I graduated, I think it was May of 1944, and I was called into service in the Navy in August 1944.
Were you drafted into the Navy, or did you enlist?
No.
I see.
I avoided being drafted, having submitted my application to enlist, and I enlisted because there were 2 or 3 friends that I knew in the class ahead of me who were already killed in World War II as Army privates, and I did not feel that was too much of an option for me. So I went into the Navy in late August, before my birthday, and did my boot camp training. I think it was about 10 weeks at Sampson, New York, which is near Geneva.
What do you remember about basic training or boot camp?
I remember it was several things. One was learning how to follow the instructions of our, our person that was responsible for our class.
Like a drill instructor?
Sort of a drill instructor. And then I knew also, or I witnessed also, a training that we had as young recruits of how to abandon ship. We had to dive off a diving board, feet first, at about maybe 20 feet up. And I remember several of the guys in the class got down on their knees crying and pleading with the instructor not to do it, that they would not do it. And they had the instructor and assistants that were there in the pool had a sweet talk. There was about 3 guys that said they couldn't swim, and they were afraid of the water.
Was this a swimming pool you were diving into?
Yeah.
I see.
No, it was not out in the lake. And it was got to be cold outside. And another thing was we were also taught how to handle a rowboat, a magnet, that would be on the side of a ship.
Mm-hmm.
And we out on the lake, and I remember how cold it was. Even though we had what they call a pea jacket and gloves, it was not the most exciting time, except for the coldness. That's about basically.
Do you remember your instructors? What sort of men they were?
They were Navy men, maybe with 1 or 2 stripes, meaning they were third class or second class, whatever rank department that they were in. Maybe it was in training. I never thought about it.
Were they tough on you, or were they compassionate, or how did they handle their relations?
They were mostly compassionate. And we had a Navy chief, a guy that came up through the ranks and was one step away from being a warrant officer. And he was in charge of all the men in that unit. I can't remember what the unit number was, but he would take us out on the tarmac for drilling and singing pep songs as we marched along. And there was always competition among the recruits from each unit. And the officers would inspect it, wouldn't judge that which one. And you got an extra day at Liberty in Geneva.
So I'm assuming that forethought of getting extra liberty helped you get through basic training.
Yeah, it did. Well, I was learning a lot too. And it was because all of us knew why we were there was to ultimately get assigned to a ship. And but that didn't happen to me. From my testing, when I went into the Navy, they put me in a training to be a signalman, which was another 8 to 10 weeks at the same location. And speaking of cold on the water, we had to do watches, 4-hour watches, while we were in school. And it was usually very cold, particularly at night on the midnight trick. And we'd always find a way to stay warm by not jumping, but finding an open door to the boiler room, which had coal to keep the boiler working, and warm up that way.
Jim, was there a name for the naval station there at Sampson, New York? It was
just Sampson Navy Station.
Sampson Navy
and
Station.
Now it's been later, after the war, I think it was converted into an Air Force base, and so it no longer existed after the war. But it was near New York, Geneva, New York, in what they call the Finger Lakes.
Finger Lakes.
Yeah.
How long were you in signalman school then?
I think 8 to 10 weeks, 8 weeks at least. And we were taught how to use the Morse code, how to use the pennants and the flags, how to use the lights. And usually when they finally got a ship, we'd have to be aware of the code password out on the water when we were challenged by maybe another Navy ship off in the distance.
Was the Morse code hard to learn?
No, because I had been in the Boy Scouts before that. And we had a little bit of a training when we were kids.
I think it would be like a foreign language almost.
But I could, yeah, but I would practice when I got aboard ship of reading when we were challenged. And it was not my time for duty, but I would pick up on it. And we would practice among ourselves on aboard a ship.
Were you using
U.S.S
the Morse code just for the light signals, or did you also have electronic, I mean, were you tapping out the Morse code in a transmitter?
No, that would be the radio man. There was another section of the...
So it was the light blinking.
We were usually on the very top of the ship, and just above the quartermaster, who was operating the wheel in direction under a supervisor officer.
Where did you go after signalman school then?
Well, I went to the commissioning of the U.S.S Turandot. I think it was in the spring of '45, while all the fighting was going on in the Pacific.
So this was a new vessel then? It had just been launched and
Yes.
outfitted?
They called it, it was built in, I think, in Massachusetts, but it was the Kaiser, K-A-S-E-R shipyard. And I
Kaiser
remember
Shipyard.
my mother and my younger brother were present at the time of its commissioning.
How do you spell Turandot?
Turandot, T-U-R-A-N-D-O-T.
Thank you. And remember the whole
AKA
number?
47.
Thank you.
Being in storms, we thought the ship was going to crack wide open.
When you joined the Turandot, did you go on some shakedown cruises initially?
Yes, we did go on.
So you were among the first full crew complement
Yes.
on the new vessel, is that right?
And we also had training for the anti-aircraft people. I think it was 40 millimeter, shooting at targets out on the ocean, in the Atlantic, before we started going down to the Panama Canal.
So that was really your first cruise. You were headed to the Pacific, I assume, is
Yes.
that right? What was it like going through the Panama Canal?
Well, my thoughts at that time was how historical. I knew about the building of it and how tough it was for the contractors to meet the specifics. And you could see some of the natives of Panama waving when we went through. And it was quite a thrill. We also could see a jail, and I think it was for German prisoners of the war, that was not too far away from the canal itself. But it was a long day.
Were the prisoners, German prisoners, being used as laborers there to
No, I
maintain the
don't
canal?
know.
Okay.
I don't know, but they may have been. But everywhere we went through the canal, people would be on the shore and wave at us. And and we also looked down and could see how many inches were left on each side.
This would be the width of the canal as opposed to the ship being
And
in
the
it.
width of the ship.
The ship pretty much fill some of the locks?
Yeah, it was pretty close to scraping. And I think later on in our lifetime, they widened it, the canal, in many places.
How long did it take you to go through the canal?
I think most of a day. And I remember looking up at there was a bridge over the canal, and it was an international date line. And it was well announced by the signs on it. And I was going to say, later on, my wife and I went through it. And same signs and same places. And
Looked the same, in other words, is that right?
looked the same. We finally got crossing the Pacific to Honolulu, and where we picked up about 400 to 500 Marines with all their gears, as well as about a couple of hundred at the most of Navy Seabees.
Where was this then, Jim?
In Honolulu.
Honolulu.
And let's see, I think about that time, the war was near close, was almost over when we got, so we were getting ready, in my estimation, to go to Japan.
What month and year was that?
That was, I think it was in June of 1945.
June of 45.
And then the signing came later in August on the U.S.S. Iowa.
How long did you spend in Hawaii then?
Maybe 2 weeks, because the Navy reconstructed the interior of our ship so we could have like 4 bunks with little space between each one on the walls of the ship, and put to handle about as I said, the 400 or 500 Marines. And it was pretty crowded.
The AKA ship is generally a cargo ship, is that right?
We did have cargo.
As opposed to an APA, which was a personnel ship.
Completely personnel.
Yeah.
And we carried, unbeknownst to us, later we found out that they had ammunition on board. Well, so that kind of certified that we were going to Japan.
Mm-hmm. But so they added some the bunks for embarked Marines, and so they could carry more
and
personnel.
Navy Seabees.
And
the Seabees, you know, would construct the landing places on the islands and Quonset cots, put them up for personnel.
Mm-hmm.
That was my assumption.
Were you able to get leave or liberty when you were in Honolulu?
Yes, we were.
Did you have some fun there?
Pardon?
Did you have some fun there?
I did, and mostly I was aware of Pearl Harbor because a neighbor sailor of mine in Boston, Newton was really the town where I lived, had died on the early attack at Pearl Harbor. So, and his name was Billy Kerr, Kerr. And later on, my wife and I visited Pearl Harbor, I think with one of our daughters and son, and his name was etched on a memorial there at Pearl Harbor.
Well, had he been aboard one of the ships that was bombed at Pearl Harbor?
No, I never made. Well, we went out to the memorial of the.
But had Billy Kerr been on one of the ships?
Yes, the Arizona.
The Arizona?
When I saw it, first, it was leaking oil. It leaks oil all the time. I don't know that. And his parents and family were members of my church, Mary Immaculate, in Newton Upper Falls. And I can still picture him coming by before the war, getting off the train, going by our house to get to his house, and is dressed in his navy whites. And here he was assigned to the Arizona, which was one of them sunk, and there's so many bodies on it yet. But that, as I say, you get used to the fact that people in the neighborhood, young guys, were getting killed. Because at that time, I don't know where you got them, but people would have stars in their window on a little flag, and when somebody died, they'd change it to a gold star. If it was, no matter what service they were in.
The Blue Star then showed that someone from that household was serving in the military.
Correct.
And then when it changed to the Gold Star.
When it changed to gold, it means
that somebody died.
They died. And there was many books written, or articles written about the war at that time. As far as the Navy, they had the Sullivan brothers. I know that became well known in the States, where they're all on board one ship and they never made it back. And I think the Navy immediately changed their policy of more than one from a family being aboard the same ship. It was very interesting. Well, I was interested in it because later on in college, I studied history and government, and a lot of that was covered then. But there was also a lot of guys from the war effort that went to college with me.
Getting back to your time in Honolulu then, before going to the Western Pacific, what sort of liberty were you able to take when you're
We just went ashore.
To the beach at all?
Went ashore and maybe had a beer or two, and I ran into a couple of guys from my hometown that we used to play hockey with and golf with, just walking the streets. And it was fun seeing them, and I had a picture taken at that time, and I don't know where it is. Maybe my daughter has it somewhere. But his name was Vincent Burke, B-U-R-K-E. And I don't think it was his brother, but there was another fellow from Newton that was with him, as I remember. And we were all waiting for our ships to be loaded, as I said, expecting that we were going to Japan, because most of the major battles had occurred by the time we got there, like Okinawa being the last. I think it was the last one.
Jim, where did you go after you sailed from Honolulu then? Where did the ship go from there?
Well, while we were underway, apparently, the war ended officially. And we were diverted to Wake Island, which was still held by the Japanese. And while we were on board ship, which is a long way south of Pearl Harbor, Many of our passengers, Marines and Seabees, stood in chow lines most of the day, from breakfast to supper. And there would be occasional times when the young Marines would cut in line ahead of these mostly married men in the Seabees, who were carpenters, bricklayers, and so forth, and welders, and were usually about 7 or 8 years older, and because of their skills, had very much were very much how am I going to say, strong with arms, and that every night would have a settled boxing match on the ship, and the Marines kids who were 19, 20 like myself and gung-ho would be challenged by the Seabees, and usually the fight was over in 1 or 2 rounds usually by the Navy Seabees.
The muscle guys. The Seabees, that stood for Construction Battalion, is that right?
Right.
Yeah.
The letter C and a B. Seabees.
How long were...
Or sometimes they spell it S-E-A-B apostrophe S.
Or B-E, B-double-E.
Yeah.
And that's kind of one of their symbol. I can see it with a CB with a hammer and saw, or a CB, like a honeybee.
And we had Navy construction people in Pearl Harbor going through the ship and welding up these bunks, Before that, we carried everything on our shoulder, including a hammock. And you wrapped all your stuff into a sea bag, and then the sea bag was also canvas-like with your name on it, and you carried it on your shoulder and extended high above your head, like the bag was in the middle of a U.
So when you were sleeping on board ship, you actually slept in a hammock then?
Yeah.
That you strung up at night then?
Yes. Before we got to Pearl Harbor.
But then after Pearl Harbor, you had regular bunks then that were stacked.
Yeah, they were about 18 inches apart, it seemed like. Unlike the submarines, they tell me, had when you went on watch in a submarine, somebody else would take your bunk and sleep there because they didn't have that much space. From what I could remember, stories like that.
How long did you spend at Wake Island?
Well, when we got to Wake Island, there was a contingent of Japanese troops there, and they were allegedly starving, even though we found out that they had taken over Wake Island when, what did they call them? K-rations were the food, in a canister of some kind, and several of the Japanese troops got sick from them because I don't know why, but so they wouldn't eat anything that was American, that was in storage.
They must not have liked the American K rations, right?
No, right. And that was my, anyway, when we pulled into port, there was a Navy hospital ship just tied up near us with all the nurses and just like Mr. Roberts later in the movie. And we were besieged to use our telescopes to look at these girls, even though we'd been out only several weeks, you know, out in the ocean. And as I say, we thought we were headed to Japan, but so then we got diverted to Wake Island, and the Marines went ashore and took over the island. Some of them did. And it was just, to me as a kid, we just looked like the movies depicted them, with the officers sitting under the shade and the troops out there working under the sun. And it was repeated or rumored that the Japanese had which set bombs that exploded when the Marines were pulling the lids off the tanks that the Americans lived. But it occurred when the Marines that were on our ship were injured because of the traps that the Japanese had set.
The booby traps that they set.
And I never. Well, rumors sped quickly throughout the ship, and I never know of anyone ever saw an example of that happening. Mm-hmm. And except the Navy ship treated all these Japanese troops for starvation because they wouldn't eat it, and they didn't have anything to eat.
Were you able to get off the ship and go ashore then at Wake Island?
No.
Okay.
Just the Marines went ashore. And from Wake Island, there was, as I remember there were ships, wreckage of ships, tied up a long while from the war itself that had been bombed or fired on both American and Japanese. And I never looked into the history, except Wake Island was a stop originally before the war for Pan American Airlines. And a lot of civilians lived there. But I ran into one lady later who was a resident. And she told me how they had lived and worked there, and how they were abandoned or forced off the island before the real fighting started. It was so it was interesting from that point of view.
When you left Wake Island, were the Marines that had gone ashore, did they re-embark on the
yes,
the Turandot then?
As far as I know.
Okay. Where did you go after Wake then?
We went to the New Hebrides. Hebrides, which is near New Zealand, not too, and a little bit further away from Australia. And Australia at that time, and had been before we got there, a Navy shipyard for repairing the big ships that had been hit during the war. Mm-hmm. And
was that at Sydney, Australia then? Was that at Sydney, Australia? Where
I
the
don't
shipyard
know
was?
where the port was.
I see.
And later on, when I was in the FBI, I met the guy that was commander of that Navy yard. And it was really, and he was a neat guy, and his wife and daughter were with him, and they were acquainted with another FBI agent that I knew. And so we met him this was after the war. We met him in Fort Lauderdale, where he was a civilian person in charge of the Fort Lauderdale Yacht Club. And it was interesting talking to him. And he was a full-ranking captain, one step below an admiral. But very, very nice and talk. I think he welcomed somebody talking about the war, because my friend in the Bureau also was a guy that had been in the Navy.
How long did you spend in the New Hebrides then?
Maybe a week. And I don't know why. I think we unloaded some of the Marines there, and I don't know why. And then as our ship got ready to leave, they had Operation Red Carpet started. Red Carpet was bringing back troops and men that had been ashore for 3 to 4 years, and they had established a point system to get you off the island or to get you back into the system ready for departure and discharge to your home. It was, I went ashore by myself, and it was a pretty isolated area. And I ended up walking into a native village, just like the movie showed. Men were nearly naked, as was the women. And I do remember them calling me Joe. Hi, Joe. And they were very cordial. How are you, Joe? And I don't know what language they spoke, but I waved to them, and then I realized I'm out there by myself. Nobody knows where I am. So I turned around and went back to the ship, which was probably a couple of miles away, 2 or 3 miles.
Was the ship docked, or was it
Yes.
at anchor?
Yeah, it was at anchor.
At anchor.
No, it was docked, I'm pretty sure.
You were unloading cargo and things like that?
Unloading cargo and then putting guys that had been military guys stationed there.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what happened to the Navy ship that was up in Wake Island.
Jim, let me ask you about your duties, I guess, as a signalman at sea, or generally when you're at sea. And
generally, they were 4-hour watches that you rotated with the rest of the signalman crew, and we were alerted every day to a different code if you were challenged by your ship. Mm-hmm. The one time I remember being challenged was on our way back to, I guess, to Long Beach. We took all those red carpet, what they call the red carpet people, military.
The people had enough points to return.
Had more than enough. Mm-hmm. They'd been out on the island for years. And anyway, in the Pacific area. And one time, I, as a 18-year-old, 19-year-old, I was much thinner, and I had the midnight watch, and we must have been going near Guam or Saipan, and our ship was challenged from shore. And I fell asleep on the signal bag, which was a storage. I don't know if you call it a bag or not, but we call it a storage bag for each of the alphabetic letters, different colors. And on top of it was a canvas. It was a two-tier two-tier covered flag bag storage, and it was a nice warm night, and I was up there all by myself, and the next thing I knew, I fell asleep in one of the lower parts of the bag on the canvas. So it was firmly tied down. And the next thing I knew, I was being shaken awake. And I opened my eyes, and there was a full officer, a lieutenant, 2 stripes. And he's shaking me, and he said, "Flags, flag." I remember that. Saying, "Flags, what's that light on shore calling? Are they calling us?" And I quickly looked at it, and I said, "Yes, sir, they are." He says, "Get up and answer them." And he was kind of upset, which I couldn't blame him, because I figured I was going to be locked up in court-martial for at least 10 days to a month for falling asleep on. He says, "Oh, answer them, will you?" And I said, "Yeah, they're challenging us for the code of the day." And he said, "Do you know it?" And I said, "Yes, sir."
Now, Jim, this was by light signal? Is that
Light
what
signal at night.
Right.
And we had like a 24-inch carbon light, which was way up along the stack of one of the stacks, on each side of the stack. And you had to kind of turn it on to warm it up, because it was all charcoal up there.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, I answered them, and we both signed off, and he waited, and he says, "Stay awake," and he never charged me. But he was one of the fellows, men rather, that was in the military, in the Navy, when the war broke out. And he became a Navy chief, and then became an officer while he was out on the ocean. And he was, so I never boasted about what he did or bragged about it, because I knew he was also not doing his job and maintaining restrictions over me.
Well, it was nice enough to you to
Oh yeah,
get you awake and get you to return the signal.
right. But that was one of the most scary moments in my life.
Jim, when you were in the Navy, and particularly at sea, did you see combat? I mean, was your ship attacked by aircraft
we were never attacked.
shells or anything like that?
As I said, it brings back another. I think we went to Honolulu on that trip from New Hebrides, because I think they had a ship going to the States, and we stayed out there. I don't know why, but they had bigger ships going back to the States than Red Carpet. And I had an opportunity to go on Liberty in Honolulu at the beach, where the Royal Hawaiian.
This was your second visit to Honolulu.
I used that, and the Royal Hawaiian Hotel was about 7 or 8 stories high, and contrary to what I saw later in 1980s, it was peanuts, because they had built so many high rises that were 20 stories or more high, all maintained by the Japanese in the 1980s.
In 1980s.
We won the battles, but we lost the war. That was my feeling. Anyway, I got a sunburn, both shoulders bubbled up, my nose split open, and I had only been out on the beach for an hour or less, and enjoying the water great. So when I got back to the ship, I went to see the doctor, and he had to report that I was not able to work. And so the executive officer, who was the second in command of the ship, wanted to process me for a court-martial for dereliction of duty. And fortunately, the doctor went to bat for me because of my youth.
And only 1 hour in the sun.
And
Wow.
1 hour in the sun. It was a scary, not a scary moment, but a learning session in my life. And and then later on, well, not later on, but I realized the doctor was a graduate of Notre Dame, so I had to be partial to him. And I thanked him for going to bat for me.
Mm. Were there any casualties on your ship?
Never. Not that I know of.
Okay.
But everybody, we had 30 small boats, landing craft, what we call small boats. And all the guys that were trained to use them were, had been trained in Florida and Georgia, offshore, for piloting each of the boats.
Mm-hmm.
And they were on the crew that maintains the living quarters for other sailors on board the ship, and they were also in charge of painting and keeping things in order,
Mm-hmm.
sweeping down. I can still hear them saying, "Sweep, time to sweep fore and after," when it was time for supper. Now here it is, something like that. The time, and I'd say, "Clean, sweep down fore and aft."
Jim, were you ever wounded then?
No.
Wounded in combat. And
No.
were you ever a prisoner of war?
No,
No.
I was not.
Did you receive any specific medals for bravery or doing a good job? Or?
No, just a medal for peace that they gave to everybody. And as I say, we had great rapport with the guys in the radio shack, as we call them. And a lot of the fellows were New Yorkers that were radio men on our ship. So there was always a talk about New York, New York. And of course I learned well enough to not say anything, and learned a lot about New York or different places. Everybody asked you where you were from. And I know some of them guys would, because I had a distinct New England accent, and they would laugh at my language being harsh, you know. But I do remember working that one ship, when was it? On the way back to Honolulu. There were a couple of Navy guys that would, and I was forewarned about them, that would appear up on the top deck with you, stark naked, allegedly looking at the weather and charting it. And I'm pretty sure they were homosexual. And, or at that time, they used the word queer. And I remember two different men when I was working that shift. Not at the same time, two guys, but one guy each. And they had a great big pad of paper, and like they were writing. And I said, I may be green, but I'm not that green. So, although they were cheerful, and I guess they were motivated, but
Jim, how
nothing.
did you keep in touch with your family then when you were at sea and in the Western
We
Pacific?
wrote letters. And now I guess they don't. Now you get a phone and you can call anywhere. No, but we did. I wrote to my brothers and sisters on their birthday and the cards. Well, one of the best things in my memory, as the war ended, before I guess we went to Wake Island, was going to Mass at the Honolulu Bowl. And only because I remembered it, due to the fact that the bowl had a Mass of celebration. It was August 15, the Feast of the Blessed Mother. And I went to the Mass, and lo and behold, there was about 3 or 4 cardinals, which is, one of the high-ranking people in the Catholic Church. And the chief celebrant was Cardinal Spellman, S-P-E-L-L, I think, man. And he had confirmed me when I was 12 years old in Newton, Massachusetts, because he was at the Sacred Heart Parish in Newton Center as a bishop. And he was then elevated to the cardinal job in New York while I was still in high school. And he became, during the war, became chief of all the clergymen in the service. Protestant, Jewish, everything were under his command.
And even after the war, he was well known for
Oh yeah,
a number
he
of
was
years.
well known for his writings and his actions that he took. And
Was it August 15, 1946, after VJ Day?
yeah, yeah, that's when it was. Wait a minute, no, was it 40? It had to be 46. After the, no, it couldn't be because I get the dates now screwed up.
Again, what year was it when you were at the Honolulu Bowl then, Jim?
1945.
August 15, 1945.
Yes.
Just at the end of the war.
Right. So we had seen a lot of travel in that short time from the commissioning of the ship in the spring of 45.
Okay. We're at the end of tape 1 with the interview with James F. Campbell, U.S. Navy, World War II. And we'll be starting tape number 2.
Wow.
This is tape number 2 of the Veterans History interview with James F. Campbell, a U.S. Navy veteran of World War II. Jim, one thing I wanted to ask you about your letters communicating with your family. Did you use V-mail? Or
Occasionally, yes.
Photographed letters?
Yeah. Well.
How often did you get mail then? Only when you were in port?
I don't remember. I don't think it was only in port. We would meet ships out at sea and transfer,
From ship
I think,
to ship?
some mail from one vessel to another and exchange mail. And one of the things I do remember is my neighbor, one of my neighbors was killed a year ahead of me, graduated, Ned Gorman. He was killed at Metz, and I knew all of the kids. We used to play kickball in the street and so forth, and we were so innocent at the time. I remember as after the war started, I barely knew where Pearl Harbor was, except it was in the Pacific. And I was my brother and I, and a younger brother yet after that, were Boy Scouts. And when the war started, we were a dispatcher, our runners, by our troop, when we had practiced blackouts. And everybody outside where we lived had assignments, like in schools, to convert them to hospitals and so forth, in case there was actual bombing. And they had some German prisoners had been captured off the coast, mostly in New York.
Who captured them, do you remember?
Well, the FBI took, I think it was Coast Guard.
The FBI interviewed them at all?
Oh yeah, and they prosecuted them there in Washington, in one of the rooms where we later had training classes. And these were guys that got ashore from submarines, but they had been observed by public after dark.
Did they also have coast watchers too? Civilians who were watching the coast from the United States?
I don't remember, but I do remember that we had to put black cloth over our windows so that it wouldn't give the German subs profile of the coast from all the lighting.
What did you do as a runner then with the Boy Scouts?
Well, and it was practice blackouts, and we'd have to, at that time, carry messages from one post to another, which was usually, not too far apart, like 5 or 6 blocks away. And we had enough kids that were in Boy Scouts that they trained us to where to take them and how to get into the school. And some of that was pretty, as I say, pretty much casual information. They had wardens on each street, and they'd go around to see when they were having these practices, to see if any lights were shining from your house, and they'd notify you to get them corrected.
Well, they were practicing for what possibly could
happen
during the war. Could happen.
And we would have schools during the day would close. I remember being in high school, and they had buses there, even though we rode our bikes to school, to take us home. It was mandatory you get out of the high school and get to your residence. And I still visualize many of the young girls crying their eyes out, thinking it was real, which it turned out to be a practice, but we weren't told that it was a practice. And there was a lot of tension, and a lot of our teachers were volunteers or working in shipyards in Massachusetts, building these ships and tanks in Watertown. The tanks were built there in Watertown in a conveyor type building that was almost a mile long. And they when they were finished, they'd go shipping them overseas. And Watertown was the next town to me.
Jim, back at the Navy, what was the food like when you were aboard ship?
I had no complaints about the food. I was happy to get food. And the cooks were great, I thought.
You weren't eating K rations or C rations?
No, we never had to lower our standards, if that's what you call it. It was good food and coffee. And when I was on top of the ship underway, God, that they would have their bakery of bread going, muffins or real bread, and that odor would drive me nuts. Which was, a hot, steaming odor of biscuits being.
You probably were getting the air conditioning exhaust on the bakery up
above.
On watch.
Yeah, it went all the way up to the stack of the I guess you'd call it like a chimney.
And supplies, your ability to get supplies that you needed, was that any problem? Just general supplies, I suppose, food and other medical supplies and things.
Well, we had on board ship. We had a doctor that was supervisor and all of the medical staff, which would be usually male pharmacist mates, and they had been trained to get to the wounded quickly and so forth. But thank God I never had to go on that, to go ashore under the battle time.
Did you feel pressure or stress at all when you were aboard the ship?
The only time is like when everybody was stressed was for inspection, which was usually every Saturday morning, and you had nitpicking stuff from these 22-year-old officers, that had college degrees.
How about entertainment? How did you entertain yourselves on ship? Did you have movies or?
We had movies.
U.S.S
yes.
shows or?
We had movies and mostly talking about girls and guys and different baseball, football teams that were active then. And it was not, I'm trying to think of, well, I remember in boot camp we had Joe Louis, who was then heavyweight champion of the world. He came and put on a show for us at Sampson, New York. And everybody got excited about that because he had survived some matches, and of course the color issue of the skin was prevalent. Joe Louis was black, and all the white guys had tried to beat him and they couldn't. And they used the N-word a lot, and he was from Detroit, which I didn't even know where it was, hardly. Anyway, later I saw, strange to say, I was working the night shift in Detroit, and he showed up to talk to the boss or the assistant, ASAC.
Joe Louis did?
Huh?
Joe Louis showed up in the
Joe Louis.
office?
He lived in Detroit.
This is the FBI office?
Yeah. And I opened the door, and there he is, after 4 o'clock at night. It was after 6, really. And I remember who he talked to, the assistant boss. And he was broke financially, we learned. The money he got had been stolen from him by his managers. And he was looking, I don't know what he was looking for, some relief, from what I gathered. But I immediately thought of the day when I saw him working out in Sampson, New York, when he was a young guy in great shape. And I knew what, before the war, what the matches that he won were, as I said, were over white guys that were highly touted as heavyweights and good boxers.
But they're no match for Joe Louis, right?
No, he was good. He wasn't like, what was the name? Ali, the later guy.
Muhammad Ali?
Muhammad Ali.
He lived in Berrien Springs?
Yeah.
Yeah, he just died a few years ago, as I remember. Yeah, the champ they called him, right? Muhammad Ali.
He called himself the champ. Yeah, I guess.
When you were in the Navy then, Jim, do you remember were there any particularly humorous or unusual events that you remember? Any pranks, for instance, that you pulled on other sailors? Or?
You know what happened to me one night? We were tied up at a port somewhere, either on the West Coast, Long Beach, or Honolulu. And we were having repairs to the ship, or something happened. Or maybe when they were installing the bunks, you know. Mm-hmm. And it really bothered me. The men that were skilled workers that were doing the work would leave their toolboxes, you know, all their personal tools on board the ship where they had been working, and in a nice area. I mean, they'd clean up after them. And one night, I don't know why, I was on duty somewhere, and just happened to walk into this young kid who was a pain in the neck. Took a couple of those toolboxes and threw them over the side. And the next day I saw the men who
this was the Navy
in the Navy Yard.
Man that had thrown them over.
And I learned I'm not going to say anything. But I felt bad for the guys that lost them. And this guy that did it, I would be the only one to testify. And my skin would be battered by the time I got out of there by he and a couple of his buddies who were really under the eyeball of some older married sailors, and would chew them out when it started bragging about their female conquests off the ship. But that really stuck with me. I said, these guys acquired some of their tools from their parents or their grandparents even. Anyway, that was my own feeling.
Did you take any photographs then when you were?
I took lots of photographs. I had an Argus camera, and my daughter has them now. She said I had some little booklets of them, and on board ship.
Okay.
And in Honolulu. But I didn't take any pictures in New Hebrides that I remember. I didn't have the camera with me.
What did you think of your fellow sailors and also the officers that you served with? What did you think of your fellow sailors and officers?
Well, most of them were, I'd say 90% of them were civilians in heart. And about 10 of them were career guys with the usual bad mouths about women and their conquests and drunk. And
did you keep a personal diary at all when you were at sea or in the Navy?
I think I did. My mother, or somebody read it, to me. I probably have it. when we went through the Panama Canal and my observations. I remember that. And I was, at that time, I was already filtered by lack of females that we saw from the ship, and just like Mr. Roberts later, looking at through the long glasses at them.
Jim, do you still have the diary then? Do you or does your daughter have your diary still?
I think she may have it, and but when she downsized my house here, thank goodness, she told me last night, we got lots of pictures of you in the Navy, and I didn't ask her about the diary. I forgot all about it, but I knew somebody in the house years ago were kidding me about it. When I think it was Kitty, my wife, and she was laughing. I don't know what else to say except some of the cooks. I remember them. They had a couple of Navy women. What do they call them? Spars or something. That were Navy sworn enlisted women.
Oh, the waves.
Waves. That's what
Right.
they were. And some of those cooks got the two waves that somehow they conned them into coming on board ship, and then they bragged about their conquests with the waves. These cooks had how they indicated they had a field day with them and sex way down in the bottom of the ship. And I'm not surprised because I'm not surprised in that they did because they were such raunchy guys, in my estimation.
Well, jumping ahead a little bit, Jim, do you remember the day that your service ended in the Navy?
I do not know. No.
Where were you, for instance?
I was back in. Strange to say, I was back in Boston.
Oh. So you were actually discharged in Boston then?
Yes,
right?
yeah.
Okay.
Even though I entered there, was sworn in there, but I don't remember. All I knew, I was free to go home.
Did your ship didn't go back to the port of Boston though, did it? Did you?
To where?
The Turandot didn't go back to the port of Boston. I assume you took a train to Boston then, did you?
I don't remember.
Okay.
I do not, because I remember riding a lot of trains to go on Liberty when I was in training school and through the snow drifts that are up to the wheels in upstate New York. God.
What did you do in the days and weeks after you were discharged from the Navy?
Immediately, I don't know. I think I just took it easy. And then finally some of the guys that I knew as caddies and golfers, we formed our own little league and were sponsored by local merchants somewhere. And did I cover that? No. Anyway, we ended up in what we call the 52-20 Club. And that was Massachusetts, and maybe, no, I don't think Congress, but Massachusetts sponsored a bill where every veteran received $20 a week after he was in the service to spend it for whatever he wanted. And I used most of that money, well, to give to my mother and father there, because they were out of work. My dad was out of work once the war ended, and I'd use the rest for golf fees for playing golf. And we had some pretty good guys, excellent. In fact, they were pretty excellent, a lot of them. A couple of my friends became pros. And I played with Bob, his name was Bob Crowley, and he was on the golf team at high school with us and at Boston College. At college, I was number 7 of a 6-man team, so I was available all the time. But no matter what, I was working at jobs my whole life.
Did you go back to college right away then after discharge?
We took the entrance exam with my neighbor, who was ended up at Raytheon as a career, and he majored in math, which was my weakest subject. So I leaned on him for my first year there, because
What college did you attend?
Boston College. But before I did that, before he took the exam, a whole group of us from my high school class and before, the high school offered us a pre-college training for taking exams, which was great. Mostly a lot of math questions and physics and stuff like that. So anyway, I remember the day we took him, we had to have a seat between us and a back row of us and all that stuff. And some guy tried to beat the system. And God, they caught him. He had what we call crib notes. And anyway, we got accepted. And I started in January. I think we all started in January of what was that, 46?
It would have been January of 1947?
47. Yeah, after the war.
Several months after you were discharged.
We played golf at least once a week at the local golf courses and had a great time. And then watching on television was new then, and having pizza and beer at whatever place the guys like to go to, our new place. But we never got in any
And you could do that on your $20
$20
stipend from the state.
Yeah, it was great.
Even after giving much of it to your mom and dad.
Right. I would give them at least $10. And then, but it was always some discussion about world affairs then, what did you do in the war, where were you? And
did you keep in close touch with any of those Navy personnel that you served with after the war?
Not really, not really. Oh yeah, one guy in Pittsburgh. One fella in Pittsburgh. And it turned out he became a janitor in a church. And he was from the middle part of Pennsylvania, and he invited, one or two guys invited me to their home when we were, where was it? New York? New Jersey, one guy. We became good friends during this service.
Mm-hmm.
And
what was his name?
He took me to New York. I can't remember. I can't not remember his name. But we had the same kind of likes, and we're listening, we're the same age. And I remember there was a radio show at the time, Wally, name called Henry Aldrich. Henry, it was a radio show. And he could imitate that guy like crazy. Yes, mother. I mean, this was and they'd have different incidents about life and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But this guy could do a great job. And then was another young guy from, also from Pennsylvania, who stayed in the Navy after we were all moved for possible discharge. And he became an officer in the Navy. And I remember his name was Ralph Hamme, Hamme, because we would have sometimes watched together at night and just chatting about what was going on.
So he stayed in for a career then, is that right?
He stayed in for a career and
Yeah.
apparently went to the academy. But there were other guys like that of our age bracket that ended up going to college that I sent Christmas cards to, and we exchanged for a couple of years. And
Sure. Jim, did you join any veterans organizations after the war?
I did join the American Legion for a while because my father had been a member of the American Legion from World War I.
So your father had served in World War I?
Yeah, my dad did.
What branch of the Navy?
He was in the Army.
Army.
He was drafted.
Thank you.
But he didn't see any overseas because the war was over quick, like in 1970. He was maybe about a year at the most, like a lot of men were.
Mm-hmm.
But he marched in every Memorial Day parade and carried the American flag. And we were, my two of us, two brothers and I, three, were members of the Sons of the American Legion. And we had a drill team, and we had wooden rifles, wore white duck pants and white shirts, and a little cap on our head. And whenever the parade rested, we'd put on a little drill show back and forth from having received it. It was a different time of life, I think, because there was more obvious love of country.
Mm-hmm.
And now I can tell you, Wally, when we were marching, which in a parade, it wasn't just 2 blocks, it was 2 miles at least. And the curbs were packed with people. And a couple of times we marched behind an open convertible, or 2 open convertibles, where members of the Civil War were riding.
Civil War veterans?
With their white whiskers and so, and I guess they finally all died, and they were not in the future parades. But yeah, Civil War, and I figured,
Amazing.
you know, these guys were like me. They were 17 or 16 years old when they were in the Civil War, because it was that many years after the Civil War ended that they were riding in these open convertibles.
Mm-hmm.
And being chauffeur driven. It was amazing.
Okay, going back to your time at Boston College, what was it like, interacting with other former military people and professors there at college?
Well, it was a time of great feeling for me for the training that we got at school, which was a Jesuit college.
Mm-hmm.
And we'd have religion, what they call religion, which is a Catholic religion, and philosophy, and emphasis of that kind was with priest instructors. There were lots of priests there that were Jesuits. And we had one class in philosophy every week, maybe twice a week. And I can't remember the priest's name now. What the heck was it? It would come to me. But he was very strict, very strict. And we had about 75 guys in one big class in a prominent building. And one of the things he maintained was when the bell rings, you do not open the door to come into class late. So, and he would also have all these guys shaking in their boots, including me. But when I was going to school at Boston College, I worked in a private liquor store, which this guy, this priest, would visit every so often and get 2 bottles of borderline high-priced booze, like Royal Crown or something like. And he'd come in and give when I saw him coming in off the bus, I ran in behind the back of the room so he wouldn't see me. And I didn't want him to know me, to call me up for a quiz, you know. If he called you, you were doomed, because you'd be standing there for 5 or 10 minutes listening to questions, trying to answer pop quiz questions to you. And 2 meant that's Royal Crown or Canadian whiskey, you know, imported stuff. And the other guys that owned the shop would be out front, as I call it. I could look through a peephole in the wall. And he'd arrive by bus, right, get off in front near the store in Newton Center. He could then put up 2 fingers so they knew what he wanted, put them in a double paper bag, and he'd go grab the bus going back to Boston College, which was about 2 or 3 miles away, at least, 3 or 4 miles. And
Those priests was pretty strict on attendance at classes.
Oh,
right?
he was very strict on attendance. But anyway, that's how I knew him. And the story I'm trying to bring out is one day, one of the guys in the class came in late after the bell happened. And the priest looked at him and said, "You know the rules that I have set up?" And the guy said, "Yes, Father." Whenever you got a question from a priest, you had to stand up. And at that time, we had to wear a sport coat, shirt and tie, and dress a little more than they are today. And he said, "Yes, Father, I know your rules." And the priest would say, "Well, you know, Mr. So-and-so, you came in late, and you know what that means. I'm not happy with it." And then he'd say, "Were you in the military?" And the guy would say, "Yes, I was, Father." He said, "When you were late, would you come into the class in the Army?" Or as he told him. And he said, "Yes, I would come in late." And he said, "What happened to you then?" He said, "Everybody in the room would stand up and say, 'Good morning, Captain.'" So we had to choke our laughter, even though we were guys. Some of those guys had seen a lot of combat. And they were trying to get a degree, of course, and they were married, and they would choke their laughter. And he said, the priest would say, "Sit down and don't do this again." But everybody had that story. Traveled around the campus, and we were just new guys in school. It was a wild time, a good time, because everybody had stories about their military service.
Mm-hmm. Jim, after Boston College, what did you do after graduating?
Good God. What's that?
Okay, after Boston College, what did you do then?
Well, all along in my dreams, I wanted to work in law enforcement, and I met some people that my dad knew that were American Legion from World War I, and I told him about becoming a police officer. He said, "Don't do that. Become a federal officer, because you wouldn't like it." In other words, they didn't like it. So I kept in mind, and I wrote, that was when I was a kid. I wrote an article about the FBI in junior high school, and they sent me about 2 inches of books and papers about the FBI. And Director Hoover was still in the 30s. That was when the big time guys were active, like in Chicago, and became, household names. Anyhow, when I got out of Boston College, near getting out, I sent my notice to the FBI that I was interested in becoming an agent. But I realized that I didn't have all of the requirements. At that time, Wally, you were required to have a law degree or an accounting degree. And I figured I'd go to Washington and work and get paid for it and study at night. Well, lo and behold, I got accepted as a government clerk. And with a 4-year degree, I was making less money than a high school steno who was a steno in the bureau. Mm-hmm. I think it was around, at that time, it was very low, $2,000 or $3,000 a year, on the basis of what the dollar was. It wasn't like 50 to 20 club again, where you had a lot of money in your pocket.
And this was Washington, D.C. is where you were working?
Yeah, that's where I went.
Did you go to school also then?
I went 1 year, part of 1 year, at Georgetown Law School, because I couldn't, and I had to quit because I was not getting good grades, and I was working my butt off. I went to work in the FBI on the midnight shift as a clerk in the code room, CODE room, because I think that later, as I thought about it, the FBI put code room because I was a signalman. Mm-hmm. And they thought maybe I worked with codes, which I did on this, but with the light, but in the code room, the FBI at that time had several prominent movie directors living in Europe who acted as agents for the Bureau and the Russian, and reported on everything about the Cold War with the Russians. And I remember also Senator McCarthy from Wisconsin was a friend of the director, and the newspapers were on his tail because he was in charge of, I think in charge. He had a lot to do with evaluating movie stars as communists. And Hoover hated communists. He would say they're communist, not communist, but communist. And anyway, the code room in headquarters then was directly below Hoover's office, and we had to like send up on a vacuum container like in some of the stores.
Pneumatic tube?
What do they call it?
Pneumatic tubes?
Pneumatic tube.
Yeah.
But we were working midnight, and I'd go to college, law school, and I'd hardly stay awake in class because anyway, I had to leave, and much to my regret, partially because I didn't do well in class, and because I was tired, and I could hardly keep up in my studies, including weekends when I had weekends off. It was tough at Georgetown, and a lot of guys were there and women from the Defense Department and Army officers. There were majors, usually majors and above. It was another learning experience.
Okay, after you dropped out of law school then, Jim,
I was still working for the FBI as a clerk.
when did you become an agent then?
Well, in the meantime, the director, Hoover, dropped the requirements to become an agent to most military people and school teachers who had leadership jobs in the Navy. So I applied anyway, even though I was not a ranking officer or anything after school. And then after college, I applied to the FBI, and I took the agent's exam. But before that time, I had to take tours as part of our training, and it was the class that we were in all became agents. There was about 30 of us at least who were trying to move up from clerk. And a lot of those fellows were fingerprint classifiers, which I would drive me nuts, looking at those fingerprints that were submitted. Anyway, I did that. I applied, and sure enough, I got into training school in 1951, I think. 50. Well, no, I was still a clerk in 51 in the late summer. And
that was in Washington, D.C.
And that was in Washington, D.C., and it was at the Justice Department building and in the old post office building at Quantico.
Tell me something about the old post office building. What happened to that building?
Well, now I understand it's a hotel, or a super hotel, owned by our president, Mr. Trump.
The Trump International Hotel?
Is that what it is? I don't know. I haven't been back to Washington, but I know he bought it and converted it. And I remember going to class there, and we had fans on the wall for air conditioning. It was, and then we spent a few weeks in Quantico for firearms training, and also classroom work on techniques of investigation. And it was a good time because there was a lot of comradeship. The only thing that bothered us was everybody was fighting for existence. And I think passing grade, Wally, was like 80% on those exams. And every time the door opened in the classroom and we saw this familiar face, he'd say, "Mr. So-and-so, pick up your books and come with me." And we knew they were gone. And every time that door opened, and we saw him, oh, who has he got now? One time I was challenged after we passed the physical inspection with all the assistant directors and Hoover were looking at you, and I was called out of class because I didn't look like an agent. I was, what, 5'10" or something, and 150 pounds at most. And I had to go interview with the director of the classes, and his name was Doc Watson, W-A-T-S-O. And he looked at me when I came in the door and he said, "Jim, do you know why you're here?" And I said, "I think I do." And he said, "Right." He said, "You don't look like an agent. You still look like a kid." And here's a man that was less weight than I and shorter. And I said, "Neither do you. How do you stick it out?" He laughed like hell. He says, "Get back to class." And later that poor guy took his own life. He and his wife. He killed his wife and then took his own life. It was really, gave me a terrible jolt about, because he had a good sense of humor anyway. And he says, "Get out of here and get back to class."
Well, you made it through training anyway. Where was your first office? Where were you assigned?
My first office was Dallas, and everybody laughed when they heard I was going to the South. And I did, well, along with, let's see, there were other guys going that were there a couple of weeks ahead of me, and we formed a little bit of a group, like for breakfast and so forth. But Dallas was a clean, sunny, and bright place at that time. And then sooner or later, they put me on the road to help out in some of the RAs. But I remember...
The resident agencies, right?
Yeah, at resident agencies. And one of the classes one of the places I went to was Fort Worth. And that was a big courtroom to watch and hear how the judges acted. And truly, it was great. And I remember the first case I heard was a bank robbery where 3 guys, all white guys, as opposed to black, were being sentenced for bank robberies. Not 1, but 2 or 3. And they had all of their families there in the courtroom, and they got time in prison. I don't know why, but the families started screaming and crying, and so, and I said, "Oh my God, this is what I'm going to be putting up with." And that made a distinct impression. And then later I got, within 3 or 4 months, I got transferred to Amarillo, and that's where I spent about a year.
I see.
And at that time, Amarillo had been selected as a place for an atomic energy plant. And I had to do backgrounds on civilian people that had a lot of drunkenness and background in their background. I don't know what else to, but had a few. I got out on the highway like Dalhart and Borga, Texas, which was way up in the Panhandle, and had a great time meeting law enforcement guys down there.
And Jim, eventually you were transferred to Detroit.
Yes.
And you met a young woman there.
Yes.
That became your wife. Do you want to tell us
Her
about
name
that
was,
story?
I got there in Detroit just when they were having a end of the season almost of a picnic area for the office over in Windsor, Canada. And I didn't know a soul. And I noticed this young lady in the past, and for about a week in the office as a secretary typist. And I took her a picture, unbeknownst to her, as she was riding a horse that she and two other girls had separate horses that they rented at the picnic in Canada. And within a week, I got the picture back, and I went into her office where she was typing and gave her a picture. And she was taken back. I could see it. There were about 4 or 5 other girls in there typing. And all of a sudden, I realized I'm talking to her and everybody's listening because they weren't typing.
You're suddenly quiet.
It was suddenly quiet. So then I gave her the picture later on, as I say, later on, and I asked her if she'd like to go out for coffee with me sometime, or break or something, or a date. And she, yeah, that would be interesting, you know. And I was 26, 20, and she was 21. And that caused a lot of problems when we did become engaged. And with her brother, who thought I was an old geezer.
What was this young lady's name?
Her name was Mary Catherine, commonly known as Kitty Brooks. And she was a pretty young lady, very intelligent and very well read, and she was from Fall River, Massachusetts originally. And that was a big factor in showing her my picture to her mother, saying, my mother-in-law, I mean, and saying that I had been raised in Massachusetts, because the potential mother-in-law questioned her about my background. And then when she told her that I was a Catholic from Boston, her mother said, "Thank God my prayers have been answered." So I was on Easy Street after that. And we got married October 17, 1953 in Detroit. And she was the oldest of 6 brothers and the only girl. And her dad had been a meat inspector for the Department of Agriculture in Detroit, and had never been in the service because he had all those kids. And the Army never took him. He was never drafted, I should say. But that's basic. And we lived together in Detroit, in Battle Creek, in Kalamazoo. And then early on, I traveled on per diem basis around Michigan, helping out in the RAs. I did the same thing in Texas. And I used to laugh about later on how much money I got. $9 a day subsistence in Texas. That included my meals and motel, and then 7 cents a mile for my car. And it was my own car that I bought in Dallas. And the same thing happened in Michigan. I think maybe it went up $1 or $2, but anyway, it was peanuts until Kennedy, President Kennedy, became in office, and everybody got bumped way up by comparison, because Kennedy, my understanding, wanted to know why the Secret Service was living in another hotel where they could afford it, and they told him it was because of the low subsistence.
When were you transferred to Grand Rapids, then, Jim?
The first time was in 1970. I was in the winter of 70.
Mm-hmm. And when did you retire then from the FBI?
October or November of 1980.
1980.
Right. And in the meantime.
How many years were you and Kitty married then?
How many years was I married?
Yeah.
I don't remember. 1959, no, not 1959, but my wife died after 59 years of marriage in 2012.
Okay. How many children did you have?
We had 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, and each of them were adopted. 2 of them in Kalamazoo, 1 of them in Mount Clemens when we lived back into Detroit.
Who was the oldest child?
My oldest child is Mary Cecilia, and she was, I think, born in 61. We adopted her in 61. And then Anne Elizabeth, A-N-N-E, Elizabeth, and then Timothy James in Detroit. It had a lot of funny stories, but humorous stories.
Jim, let me ask you about your military experiences and how they might have influenced you about your thoughts of war and about the military in general.
Oh. Well, first of all, you got to remember that I was thinking of joining the military service because everyone was, at that time, my graduation from high school. But when I learned that 2 or 3 guys a year ahead of me had been killed already after their graduation within a year, I felt that my obligation was to the Navy. And I had, it went back a way because I had met a friend who in Boy Scouts, and his dad owned a 8-person or 6-person inboard boat that every winter, my brother and I, for payment of scraping the boat down, got a free week at the beach where they had a cottage outside of Boston. And a lot of that influenced my Navy training. And that's where I joined up. And as you say, I had quite a love for the Navy. I really did. And it carried on. Is it after that?
What effect did your religion have on you as far as your military service and even your FBI service?
It was always, the effect was that I was always aware of my religion, my obligation to the Catholic Church as a complete holy person. I hoped, and I always had a respect for God and all the teachings, and I still do.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jim, for sharing your recollections about the Navy and even the FBI with us. This interview will be part of the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., and also at the History Department at Grand Valley State University, Allendale, Michigan. Again, I want to thank you for participating in the project and
thank you,
participating
Wally,
in the interview.
For putting up with me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
This is tape number 3 of the Veterans History interview with James F. Campbell. We're making this recording on October 25, 2018, a few days after completing his oral history interview tapes, number 1 and number 2. We're going to be recording photographs that Jim had of his World War II service. And the first one we see here looks like a portrait. Jim, who is in this portrait here that we're filming?
That's a picture, a portrait of myself when I first entered the Navy in 1944.
Jim, we think the photograph was taken about 1946, is that right?
Yes, sir.
At the end of your service?
Right.
How old were you then?
19.
I see.
Look at the bell bottoms.
Now, Jim, who is in this photograph?
That picture you're pointing to is myself taken by a shipmate on Honolulu.
So this is when you were ashore on leave then in Honolulu.
Yes.
This is a street scene here, Jim. Is this also in
It looks like in Honolulu.
Honolulu?
Yeah. In 1945.
Who was in this photograph then, Jim?
The photograph you're pointing to was a shipmate, and he was also a signalman on the ship, and his last name was Sager, S-A-G-E-R, and he was from Washington, D.C., as I recall.
And what rate was he?
I think on his sleeve there, it looks like he's a signalman 3rd class.
And is this the flag locker, or what do we have here on the left side?
Well, there's a signal light behind him. So we're up on the top deck of the ship where the lights were and the flags. But that's not a flag bag behind him. I don't know what that is. It was from Springfield.
Jim, who is in this group? Is this a group of your shipmates?
Yes, on the same ship. I'm trying to think of these fellows here. I don't know. I think the fellow way in the back was a radio man. And good friends. In fact,
Jim, who is in this picture then? Who's this gentleman?
His name is Red, nickname Red Donnelly, D-O-N-E-L-L-Y. And he was originally from Baltimore, Maryland. And acted as a radio man on board the Turandot.
And to his right then, here?
That's me in some kind of a work clothes. Looks like a heavy jacket.
And you're on the fantail then of the Turandot, is that right?
It looks like
stern?
it, yeah.
And this is a 5-inch gun, is that right?
That's what we had.
Jim, in this photograph then, is the Turandot at sea?
Apparently it is. The ship, I think it's looking from the bow to the aft, to the rear of the ship. And it looked like it might be a station for 40 millimeter weapons, because I see this like a curve.
A gun tub then, right?
A gun tub.
Yeah. This one then, Jim. And what ship is this, or is this another ship like yours?
I can't recall whether it was an AKA or an APA, a troop transport. It looks to be larger than the ship I was on.
Okay. And you're taking the photograph then from your ship, the Turandot, is that right?
Correct.
Okay.
And there may be something in the back of the photo, Wally.
It looks like we have two ships here then, is that right, Tim?
Yes.
Left and right.
Right.
And these would be landing craft, you think?
Nothing. Landing craft usually that I'm thinking of had a flat bow, and when we get near to land, the whole thing would drop down.
Oh yes, they have a ramp then that drops.
Yeah, and that's.
This looks like a formation of some of your shipmates then, Jim. Who is this individual then?
That fellow's name was Acton, A-C-T-O-N. He was a radio man, first class, and he was from Miami, Florida, originally. I know of him because we used to have a lot of conversations, and I would tell him about MIT, which was a school that had accepted him as a student after the war. Wally, are these people?
Jim, what is this this small boat inside a landing craft?
Yes. Because you can see the drop in the front, from the front of the landing craft.
Mm-hmm. And why would it be inside the landing craft then?
Because they didn't have a place to put it.
Just to store it then?
Yeah.
On board?
And we got in water deep enough, they could drive it right, pilot right, push it off into the water. It was mostly used when we were ashore. The captain would ride ashore on that small boat. I really don't know the answer to your question, why it was in there.
Now this ship here, Jim, I see on the bow there's a number 47 on it.
Yes. That's a number of the ship, AKA 47 U.S.S Turandot, T-U-R-A-N-D-O-T. I was a signalman on shift from the day it was christened till the day it was demobilized.
Here are some small boats. It looks like they're lifted out of the water.
They're being lowered into the water.
To be lowered into the water.
Anyway, go ahead.
There's a designation here that says KA 47-14. What would that
I think KA is the ship. I don't know why, but it should be AKA, but maybe they had enough of printing on it to designate it as a U.S.S Turandot. And they're showing that the vessel, or the boat being either lowered or brought back up from the water is one of 30 ships of landing craft that we had, and that would be the number 14 boat coming back onto the ship or being loaded from the ship for practice.
Jim, what is this, the signal light?
Oh, sorry. That was I guess what they call it, an ARC light, about 24 inches in diameter, and it was built adjacent to the stack of the ship, the smokestack. And occasionally we'd have to use that for a longer distance as you were being challenged across the ocean.
So you would, using the shutter, you would transmit Morse code,
Yes.
light signals to other ships?
Or we were always aware of the code, 5 code digits of the day that was being used to further identify you. That's all I remember about it now. And most of the guys in the ship's crew were trained in Florida to pilot those small boats to take people ashore, landing people.
This is the captain's gig, is that right?
It looks like it is a captain's gig. It's mark KA 47-1, which would indicate the captain's boat whenever he was near shore, tied up, if he wanted to use it. Usually when we were near a port.
These are 2 radio men then, is that right, Jim?
Yes.
Who is this on the left?
The man on the left, his last name was Cohen, and he was from the Bronx, New York, and a quite intelligent guy, as well as the man on the right in the picture is Red Donnelly from Baltimore. And I know that's him because where were we? Tied up somewhere along the East Coast, and he invited me to his parents' home for a meal. This guy was from South
Who's
Boston.
in this photograph then, Jim?
Me.
Okay.
This is myself standing near the bridge of the U.S.S. Turandot, aka 47. We were offshore from a small island, which I cannot recall its name. And you can see my hat has been dyed blue because that was mandatory then, so we wouldn't give the enemy white hats to be plucked out of the...
In this photo here then, Jim, what is the significance of the canvas there?
Well, the canvas is on top of what we call a signal equipment, and it was where we kept all the pennants and other signal equipment covered in 2 sections of the big bag. And that's how I knew it. It was a cover for all the pennants, and you could sit on it, and the bag was always taut, so it would hold your weight on it.
And this is a signal light here?
And there's a signal light about a 12-inch diameter up on the signal bridge where I worked. On 4 4-hour shifts during the evening. It had to be manned all 24 hours a day. So that's why some of these photos just show you that all the radio men, they also had to be manned for 24 hours a day. Or another.
Who's in this photograph then, Jim?
The photograph shows a photo of the chief signalman, which I was part of his unit. And he had been in the Navy possibly before the war started. And he was in charge of the signalman unit on board the Turandot.
Jim, it's too bad this isn't in color, but what is the significance of these flags?
The picture on that you pointed out is a photo of the signal bags or the pennants that were stored at a two-level position, a two-step level, so that you could quickly grab the flag and hook it onto a main line going up
Like they're doing here?
to above the ship. Yeah. And this bag of the photo shows somebody working the pennants or checking them out with the canvas cover of the bag wide open. And all the flags, there's pictures of all the flags that are within what we call the bag, even though it was the canvas was on top, and it was just wide enough for me to fall asleep one night in the lower level. Okay.
Jim, who's in this picture?
The one picture that you pointed out is a fellow in a dress blues, as we called him, and his name was Berman, B-E-R-M-A-N. He was a short fellow, and he was definitely of the Jewish persuasion, because he always talked about the temple and his Jewish friends in a nice way. And the other picture,
This individual?
I don't know who's the other
Okay.
man, but he was also a part of the ship's signalman corps. The other picture is a picture of myself posing in a receiving position with the flags. Straight arm up over your head and one to the left on the bottom. That's a common use of the semaphore flags. Okay.
Semaphore.
God, I recognize these guys, but I don't know their names. We're all in our blues here. We're ashore.
Is this you?
No.
No, okay.
This
is, right?
This is
No.
yeah, that's a fellow named
Oh, yeah, we did have a photograph of him.
Siegel.
Sager?
Sager from Washington, D.C.
Oh, yeah.
And this was near Pasadena. We
Oh.
went to the Rose Bowl.
Oh,
And here's some more of these guys.
who is this then, Jim?
The picture you pointed out is the executive officer, or was the executive officer, second in command of the U.S.S. Turandot during the time I was assigned to it. And he actually ran the operation of the ship and deemed was in charge of all the crew, including the officers. Okay.
Well, this concludes the photographs that Jim Campbell took when he was in the U.S. Navy during World War II. And this concludes the Veterans History, Oral History interview with James F. Campbell. Jim, I want to thank you for sharing your recollections and your collection of photographs with us. This interview is part of the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress, Washington, D.C. And it's also being facilitated through the History Department at Grand Valley State University, Allendale, Michigan. And I, as the interviewer, and videographer is Wally Erickson, who worked with Jim Campbell in the FBI before Jim retired. This is the end of the recording.